While you're doing that, I will introduce him, our next speaker, Thomas Khurana, who is the chair of philosophical anthropology and philosophy of mind, University of Potsdam, since 2020, and has been a visitor in a number of places, including Yale University, was a lecturer at the University of Essex, held interim chairs at Leipzig and at Frankfurt, and has written widely on Kant and Hegel, post-Kantian philosophy. I know him most as the author of Das Leben der Freiheit, Form und Wirklichkeit der Autonomie. And today he is going to present us with the paper's title I don't have in front of me, about abstract right, formal right, in relation to morality. So I'll hand it over to you, Thomas.
Thanks so much, Dean. Can everyone hear me all right? I see some people nodding, that's good. All right, so yeah, let me start by thanking Dean, Sebastian, and Kate for the invitation to contribute to this event and then to the line that's gonna come of it. It's obviously a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this. It is a special pleasure to be to be joining today's event, because we are celebrating two of my favorite philosophers at the same time, and that is Hegel and, of course, the one and only Terry Pinkard. And in my contribution today, I'm trying to do justice to this double celebration, as most of us do, by offering a reading of Hegel that is in conversation with Terry's work, and hopefully also emulates or tries to emulate some of the virtues of his approach to philosophy. I want to say that one thing that I admire about Terry's way of approaching philosophy in particular is his intellectual generosity and his ability to approach texts in such a way that he always finds the strongest possible argument in it. And that without, on the other hand, being uncritical of what he's reading, or just handing everything over to the superior authority of the classical figure he's reading. And I think it's another remarkable feature that Terry does not just approach the authoritative figures of our philosophical tradition this way, but that he seems to approach everyone this way that he finds himself in philosophical conversation with. When I first met Terry, we were sitting in one of those slightly kitschy Italian restaurants in Frankfurt, the places where we like to go after talks. And it didn't even seem to come into Terry's mind that he might know a thing or two that I don't, or that I might not have anything interesting to say. And he was constantly rephrasing, in a way that Dean already pointed out, rephrasing what I was trying to say in ways that made it sound very, very interesting. And by the end of the night, he had already sent me his new book manuscript and asked me for notes. And I think that this kind of curiosity and generosity is not a natural given, especially in our discipline, but it's contagious in a good way. And so I want to thank Terry for it. And with that, let me turn to my actual paper. The paper is my attempt to give Hegel as much credit as I can with regard to a part of his philosophy of right that I have always found both intriguing and troubling. And that is his account of property, which serves as the very basis of his account of abstract right. Many of you will have had the opportunity to look at the paper, so I don't want to go on for too long, but I just want to reiterate the main structure of the paper and remind you of some key points before we start discussing. I will first talk a little bit about the general worry we might have with regard to Hegel's account of property that drives or motivates the paper. I will then go on to see how Hegel's account responds to these worries in 3 steps. First, his account of property of external things. Secondly, his account of the self-ownership we have of our bodies and lives. And third, the right that life has against our right to property. So what Hegel calls the right of distress. So let me first say something about the worry that motivates the paper. I will spend a little bit more time on that and then be more briefly on the actual argument. So the worry is basically that the notion of right, as Hegel presents it in the section abstract right, is based on a sharp opposition between person and nature, understood in terms of the rightful will on the one hand and the rightless thing on the other. This opposition is most directly expressed in the relation of property, in the way in which a will claims a given natural thing as its own. And it can claim a thing given in nature as its own because that thing given in nature has no will of its own, is not an end in itself. The asymmetric nature of the opposition comes out in Hegel's claim that the person has an absolute right of appropriation. Whatever the thing the will encounters can as such be claimed as property. It further comes out in Hegel's way of defining things as unfree, non-personal, rightless, and as external to freedom. And let me just share my presentation. It's really not important, but I have some longer quotes there that we might want to come back to in the discussion. So on the second page, you have these quotes where Hegel defines the thing in general as something unfree, non-personal, rightless, as something that is external to freedom as such. To possess this thing means that we can will, that the will can do with this object as it pleases, it would then seem. This asymmetry seems problematic, I think, in at least three ways. First, it seems to contain a domination model of right. If right is fundamentally abstract right, and if abstract right is au fond the right of a subject over a thing, right is the domination of the rightful over the rightless. More specifically, it is a model of the subject's domination and rule over nature. Hegel explicitly connects this notion of property to the notion that the human being is master over everything in nature. You have this quote here on the bottom of the page. That's from his handwritten notes. So yeah, man as the master of everything in nature. That this domination model is disastrous, I think, is widely recognized today. It has led to an exploitation of the natural environment that endangers our own survival on this planet. I start the paper by pointing to a number of recent attempts to respond to the situation by attributing to natural entities the status of legal persons. So not just the status of objects we have come to agree that need protection, but legal subjects that may, by means of human representation, claim their own rights. So the proposed solution is, in a certain sense, to widen the circle of legal persons and to make certain entities in nature that we have up until now only considered as property and up for grabs, so to speak, make them into legal subjects as well. So that's the first worry, that this is a domination model of right, and more specifically a form of domination of nature that has problematic consequences. Secondly, that domination model can lead to a splitting of the legal subject. When first introducing the opposition of person and thing, Hegel suggests that our bodies and lives are things as well. If that is right, the division of right and rightlessness runs through ourselves. We are asked to imagine the legal subject as the owner of their body and their life, as if those were things that could be owned. And that seems like a problematic model of subjectivity. Finally, and probably most internally to Hegel, so a third worry, the model seems to be problematic because it makes the very idea of property Hegel wants to develop paradoxical. On Hegel's own account, the true function and meaning of property is to allow the free will to give itself an external existence. Thus, the property is an objective manifestation of the will by means of which it gains this existence for others. So I think this is a virtue of Hegel's account, to not conceive of property in instrumental terms, but in expressive terms. But precisely as such a manifestation of the free will, the thing seems to stand in attention with itself. In order to become the existence of the free will, the thing itself must be rightless. Right? This is the presupposition for us to have an absolute right of appropriation. But in order for it to be the existence of the free will, to embody and manifest the free will, the thing must at the same time be capable of embodying right. So the thing is a rightless expression of right, or an expression of right through rightlessness. This seems paradoxical, at least for a start. So the question is, how can this be? So these are the three worries that drive the paper. Now I take it that we are not giving Hegel enough credit if we suggest he just embraced the position that leads to these three worries. I rather think that he takes care to express the tension between person and thing, subject and nature, right and rightlessness, in the stark terms that he uses to help us see that right finds an inadequate expression where it relies on this domination model. We can see this by attending to the details of his account of property of external things, his account of self-ownership, and by attending to the law of distress. And so that's those are the three sections of the paper in which I try to show that Hegel's account is richer than we might first think. All right. Let me say a couple of words on these 3 points, and then I would like to open things up for discussion. So first on the model, on Hegel's understanding of my possession of external things. So the way in which his account of property starts, it seems to start at first with a certain, let's say, identification model. For Hegel, the fundamental significance of the constellation of person and thing stems from the fact that the free will, in order to realize itself as right, must gain existence. The first way in which a free will could do that is by embodying itself in a thing. By taking possession of a thing and identifying it as its own, the free will gains existence in an objective form. Hegel expresses this by saying that through the act of appropriation, the will puts itself in the thing. The will thus attains a sensible form of existence in the thing. The point of Hegel's elaboration, however, is not only to elucidate this intuition, but also to show that it falls short of the actual will, where the embodiment of the will takes the form of its identification with the thing it owns. This identification model, as I just called it, is restricted in 2 ways. It is restricted because it's too possessive oriented and it's individualist. Therefore, one could say that Hegel gives us the impression that he's a possessive individualist, but then shows us that this is not a viable option. With regard to possession, so while possession initially makes me appear as a thing myself, it might suggest that I myself am a thing, as Hegel writes in one of his handwritten notes. The further development of this notion reveals the contradictory nature of this idea and shows that my destiny is that I, as a thing, nature, shall perish and become free, be resurrected, as he writes in that same note. And you have the German quotation here on the slide. So I take it, it is not simply through possession, but rather by overcoming my reification in possession that my free will gains existence. The existence of the free will is not the thing as such, it rather emerges from the thing. Already the act of mere possession involves first transformation of the thing, but things are even more clear if we attend to the way in which the thing I take possession of is to be used and the way in which I alienate my property. The way I understand and reconstruct this account by Hegel in the paper is in such a way that alienation is really the conclusion of the relation of the property relation, and it's an essential aspect or moment of the property relation that I let go of the thing eventually, and only thereby become free and attain what Hegel calls in the note resurrection. So that's the first restriction, the possessive nature, and I think that Hegel's account is made up to make us see that property is not about possession, it's about use, and then finally alienation, so a more complex relation to the thing. Secondly, the first impression we might get is that the relation, the fundamental relation we need to get into view if we have to understand property is this expressive relation between the subjective will and the thing. So we can just attend to the individual subject and the thing, and by describing their relation, understand property. But as Hegel tries to make clear, for something to be property in the sense of it being an existence of my personality, it is not enough, he says, that there is my inward idea and will that something be mine. That's in paragraph 51. Rather, it is required that the existence which my willing entails its capacity to be recognized by others. And this leads him to this important statement in paragraph 71. This relation of will to will is the true and proper ground in which freedom has existence. So whereas the initial constellation starts with one individual will and a thing and the way in which it's being appropriated, for it to actually manifest a relation of right, me having property, this thing being my property, the thing has to become a mediator between various wills. So the true ground of the true and normative ground of the property relation is the relation of will to will. So both the possessive character and the vigilist character of property is being rejected by developing these two elements of Hegel's account. Now, where does this leave us with the initial problem, namely that right depends on rightless things as the medium of its expression and manifestation? At first, it will seem that this does not seem to help us much, for precisely where the process of my property relation overcomes the identification of will and thing and passes over the individual thing itself, it requires as its vehicle unfree, non-personal, external things. That the process passes over these things just underlines that it's not about the things, and these things are merely consumed by this process. I want to say, however, that this is only true in a first stage, let's say, and I want to call it the stage of the self-destruction of the possessive motion of property. Once we have arrived on the level of property and contract, and we see that the objects that are part of this, that are the objects that fulfill the function of property, attain a different function. They become objects that are circulating between wills and are in that sense not merely destroyed, but are in a better position to actually manifest freedom. And I think that in an early remark by Marx, this comes out in a very fascinating way. And I want to read out this long quotation because I think it opens up the horizon for this different account of property that might be embedded in Hegel's account. So Marx writes, the human character of nature exists only for the social human being. For only then does nature exist for the human being as a bond with the human being. So the objects are now fulfilling the function of being a bond between the human beings, as its existence for the other and the other's existence for it, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation of the human being's own human existence. Thus, society is the complete unity of the human being with nature, the true resurrection of nature. Interesting that Marx takes up the term resurrection here. Auferstehe was what Hegel was talking about. The accomplished naturalism of the human being and the accomplished humanism of nature. Okay, that was the first point. Dean, how long have I been talking?
About 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. I'll try to be quick on the next 2 points. So that was just a brief reminder about the kind of account I tried to give of the property of external things. Now, I think that Hegel does an interesting thing in developing the concept of self-ownership. As well. And at first it seems, so the initial determination that Hegel gives of our lives and our bodies seem to suggest that we can just understand our relation to our bodies and our lives on the model of a property relation to an external thing. He subsumes our bodies and our lives in the same category of things in general, so things that are unfree, rightless, impersonal, and are external to freedom in general, which seems weird. But that's kind of the initial presentation. I think that in the further elaboration of our relation to our bodies and our lives, it then, however, transpires that we cannot understand our relation to our bodies and our lives on this model, but rather need a different understanding of ownership, if it's an ownership relation that we have with our bodies and our lives. This other model of property is the ownership of myself, or self-ownership, which I have firstly not through self-opposition and self-mastery, so it's not this kind of divided subject that he's envisioning, but through self-appropriation of my existence. And it's secondly a property which I furthermore have not against the other, but originally only through the other. In the relationship to our own body and to our own life, it becomes clear how what may at first appear to be unfree, unpersonal, rightless, and external to our freedom can itself have a right. Okay, so in that chapter, the way I developed this is by first taking a look at Hegel's account of the ownership we have of other living things. And I try to point out certain ambiguities in Hegel's account. He seems to suggest in the main text that we can own living things just as we can own things, but this does not sit well with Hegel's account of animal beings. If we look more closely at his account, and Terry has done a tremendous service by developing this account that he has and showing how rich it is. So I don't think it's possible for Hegel to hold the position that he seems to hold. And in the text, there are also certain indications that he's struggling to describe our relationship with these living animals. The case is even clearer when we come to our own bodies and our own lives. And it becomes clear here that we cannot possibly think of our body and our lives as a soulless thing that we come to animate with our will. So, I mean, here you have some of the quotations that make clear that the notion he has of my life is richer, and that this also leads him to suggest that I might have a right to my life, but not actually over my life. I think that in addition, there is a really interesting reversal, which I haven't seen pointed out by anyone, with regard to the way in which the ownership works with regard to my body. If you think of the ownership of external things, the model is such that we might at first internally, without work and effort, appropriate something or declare something ours, but then have to make some effort in order for this to be recognized. So there's an internal appropriation that precedes the external one, or that is in a certain sense more basic or more immediate. Interestingly enough, in terms of the appropriation of my body and my life, it's the case that the external recognition of my body and my life being mine precedes my appropriation of it. So I owe my body and my life actually to others, because from the point of view of others, in the eyes of the others, my body and my life are the potential existence of my freedom. I am their only possible owner, which does not mean that I don't have to do the work of appropriation, but it's based upon it already being my inalienable property, or a thing that is my own through the attribution of others. Okay, so I think that this describes a form of ownership that is and of property that, despite first appearances, doesn't fit the picture of property that Hegel first starts with. And this is another point of evidence that we can't accept the initial picture that Hegel presents us as a sufficient picture of property. All right. Very briefly in the last section, I then revisit the well-known and interesting passage in which Hegel now brings together these two things: our property, our ownership of external things on the one hand, and the relation we have to our own body and life on the other hand, and seems to suggest that the ownership, that the right to life trumps the right to property, and precisely because, as he says here in the beginning, as he says here in the beginning, the particularity of the interest of the natural will taken in their entirety as a simple totality is personal existence, as life. So we have this conception of life as a simple totality, and as such, being robbed of my life would constitute an infinite injury and total rightlessness. In the last section, I try to take this not only as an indication that property rights are, I mean, the rights of properties and the right that we have to own things is limited, but also try to show that at this point, Hegel shows us that we are pointed beyond a certain conception of right, that the whole notion of right understood in terms of abstract right here reaches a limit. And so this points us to a different understanding of right that is being developed in ethical life. We can see this in the ways in which the notion of property is reconceived in terms of Vermögen, or resources as the English translations usually call it. And we can see it in the different kind of position that things thereby attain in our interpersonal exchange. Okay, I'm sorry, I talked much longer than I wanted to, so I should just leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to your questions and to discussing these difficult matters with you.
Thank you for that, Thomas. That was excellent. I'm going to go to Alan Brudner first, since he didn't have a chance to ask a question in the first session. And just to say welcome, I've learned a lot from your work. Glad you're here, and go ahead.
Thanks very much. So and thanks for the paper. I enjoyed this paper very much, and agreed with almost all of it. But there's one question I want to ask regarding the first point you made about the relation between the person and the thing in possession. So I agree that that Hegel starts with possession as the way that the person realizes its freedom or end status vis-a-vis nature. And I agree that this is a contradictory way, because the person is dependent on the thing for realizing its independence. And so to resolve that contradiction, as you say, we have to move toward alienation, and the person has to show that he or she is independent of the thing by letting it go. And so what does the person become the true owner of? What is the object of conclusive ownership? And I think the answer you gave quite correctly, in my view, is value. What the person ends up owning is the exchange value of the material thing that he alienates, and an exchange value that's determined socially. Now, I think one implication of this is that the contractual obligation ends up being disjunctive. That is, the contractual obligation is either to perform the contract, that is, give the thing that the other person contracted for, or the monetary equivalent. That is the difference between the contract price and the market price of a substitute. In other words, so the wrong would not be breach of contract. The wrong would be breach of contract and an unexcused failure to compensate. So that, I think, is the implication of what Hegel is saying, and it turns out to have great explanatory power over actually the law of contract. It explains things that most legal scholars think can be explained only by, as the efficiency of breaches and so on. The problem, though, is that Hegel himself didn't seem to realize this implication of his idea of what we conclusively own, because in paragraph 93, he says, breaking a contract by failing to carry out its stipulated terms is the first act of coercion, or at least force, in that it involves depriving another of his property. So that makes breach of contract a deprivation of property. It makes it equivalent to theft. It would make a knowing breach of contract a crime, none of which is recognized in the law. So I guess my question is, what do you think that this is a mistake on the part of Hegel, that he just didn't see the implication of his understanding of the contractual obligation, or do you think he's still somehow wedded to the notion that what we do own is the material thing?
Thanks so much. That's a very interesting question. So I would think that the way in which Hegel thinks of the contract at this point is that I think that he would appreciate your consideration. If we think about the things in terms of value, then it would be a reasonable thing to expect that if I can't deliver the thing, there's another way to compensate, to fulfill my contractual obligation by providing something that is of equal value. But I guess that what he's concerned with here is that what binds us is what we have contractually agreed upon. And so if a contract, let's say, if a contract would not include this either general understanding or the explicit proviso that I could not deliver the thing, but instead compensate the other person, then I would be in breach of contract if that's not part of our shared understanding of what we are doing in that moment. What you are suggesting is if we have reached that level of value, then it should be a general expectation that we have, and that it should be treated that way. That if someone cannot provide what he has promised through the contractual obligation, then compensation is a way for not being in breach of contract. But yeah, I guess that Hegel here sticks, so to speak, to the letter of the contractual convention that the contract that we drew up, and is focused on that. The other interesting question that is part of the question that you raise is what we make of this notion of value if we relate it to the general problem that I wanted to raise, namely that in a certain sense the whole constellation with which Hegel begins seems to not have much regard for the things. Let's say it like that, right? I mean, they are rightless. They are matter that we can dispose of. We are invited to alienate ourselves from them in order to prove the majesty of our will in a certain sense. And if they become a representation of value, there's two ways in which we can read that. On the one hand, it seems to be the case that the things become objects that circulate between us and become a bond, and in that sense also are not. It's not necessary to destroy a thing in order to alienate myself from it. I can give it to someone else and gain something else instead. So the kind of sustenance of value also has to do with losing and getting something at the same time. So there's a way in which value allows us to appreciate a certain element of things. But what you are pointing to is obviously also that if we introduce a general medium of value, say money, there's also a way in which we now even more deeply abstract from the things. The things become, in a certain sense, representatives of a money value in a certain sense. And we abstract from them even more. So in that sense, this kind of step is ambiguous, or it's a question how we understand this kind of economical structure in such a manner that it doesn't abstract away from the things even more. So that I think that this is raised by this issue as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert Pippin.
Yeah, thanks. That was tremendously interesting, especially this last exchange, tremendously interesting. Do I understand you correctly that what you're trying to do is show that if we look more carefully at how qualified Hegel's view is of the relation of life to property as a kind of entitlement, and see the way he qualifies it, then there is a limitation on the use of property that is of relevance to the contemporary problem with a threat to the conditions of life on the planet. That seemed to me very interesting, that this Notrecht can function in that way, that it restricts. But but let me put this, I mean, I don't want to put it polemically because I really enjoyed a lot from your paper, but what if someone said to you, well, the conclusion of your paper is that capitalism can't kill us all? Well, at least we get that out of Hegel. But is there anything else that we can get out of the Notrecht other than, whatever the use of property and the possession of excess capital, whatever kind of bad things happen, and whatever we have to accept as entitlement to property, it shouldn't destroy. It shouldn't destroy the planet. Is there? I know that's not exact. You're saying a lot of other things, but in terms of this general problem of how Hegel would think of restrictions on property, private property, given the global conditions of destruction and catastrophe and everything, is there anything more to say than, well, whatever else happens, we can't destroy the planet?
Right. Yeah, that's a difficult question for me, because I'm very tentative on this point, and I'm not sure how far Hegel gets us there. What I take the idea of this right of distress to show is the limitations of the right to property, and that there is this kind of basic claim that the right to life has against it. But what does this mean in terms of the concrete institutional structure then? If we model things on the right of distress and just abstract from the first restriction that I say, or from the second abstraction that I name in the paper, namely that this case is limited to individuals, and say, well, let's consider the way in which a certain structure of property distribution endangers the whole species. But keep the element of the extreme situation, then we are stuck with what you are saying. The only thing that we then can disallow or can forbid is that capitalism would kill us all, right? I mean, that it would need to be an extreme situation. On the other hand, probably we are in one. So if we don't act in the next 10 years, it could get really dark, right? I mean, so maybe that's not nothing.
Oh yeah, that's completely important. I just meant, is it, if we consider the concept of life more broadly, is a system in which the production of excess surplus capital injures the health of workers or their psychological well-being, or doesn't provide provisions for health care, is that also something that can be folded under the right of distress?
Right. That's the interesting question, and right, and so I'm not clear how to think about this institutionally, but I think that this pointing out this right of distress points us into that direction. That if it's true that we here also are confronted with a fundamental limit of the notion of abstract right in general, then we need to progress into a different understanding of what right is. So I mean, welfare right plays no role in the account of abstract right. So to even consider questions of welfare and questions like you raised, then needs a reframing of the whole understanding of right. So I think that eventually it should point into that direction. Maybe let me stress one other aspect that is in the background of the paper. So I take it that I understand that in terms of the political situation right now, it's a powerful tool to make nature a legal subject. So to declare a river a legal subject. So then you have claim rights, the river can go to court and so on. So it's a powerful political tool. But I'm unsure about whether that is really going to fly in a certain sense. And I'm also worried that if we just think about widening the understanding of legal, the circle of entities that are included in the realm of legal persons, that the more important thing we need to consider is the relation of a legal person to what the legal person owns or is occupied with or deals with. So that we have to understand this relation in a less asymmetric, less brutal way, less brutal than the one indicated when Hegel first starts the account. And that this is necessary if we don't want to end up turning every entity that becomes an object of right also into a subject of right. And I think ultimately that would not be feasible.
Okay. Thank you. Robert Stern.
Hi, thanks very much, Thomas. Really enjoyable. So just one small quick comment before I get the question. In the quote that you just were discussing at the end there, the Notrecht, before that it says, well, in the translation you've got, as a right, not a mercy. And I was intrigued by that. But then looking at the German, it's Billigkeit. And I don't know what you think, but mercy doesn't sound like the right translation, the Billigkeit. But I want, yeah. Anyway, maybe you could comment on that briefly. But the question I wanted to ask was, yeah, in a way, going back to the beginning of your paper, because I wasn't quite sure where that ended up, that puzzle about, rights for rivers and so on, where in the end, you set it up nicely with that as a puzzle, but I was left not quite sure what the answer was, having gone through the Hegelian account. So one answer might be perhaps along the lines you were suggesting to Robert, that there's a notion of rights based on life, and maybe you could extend life, the notion of, well, you can extend the notion of life to non-human living things, and maybe that's a way of doing something with it. But I mean, a more radical thought is, well, you're never going to get this to work with the notion of rights at all. And what Hegel's actually showing you is, in the philosophy of right, that the notion of right is a rather limited tool. And if you do want to, do something more radical, as it were, by thinking about, the problems we now face, Hegel's helpful by telling you, forget rights. Don't try and shoehorn it into this bit of the philosophy of right, no matter how subtle you make your reading. Just move on and think of nature in terms of, say, obligations, but not rights, or some other structure later, as it were, in the philosophy of right. So, yeah, I was just not quite sure where you want to use the Hegel machine to address this issue that you started with in the end.
Yes, thanks so much. That's a fair point. I think I'm actually unclear about that myself, so I'm still in the process of figuring that out exactly. First, a brief comment on the translation issue. So we're struggling with that as well. So if you look it up in a dictionary, Billigkeit would be translated as equity, but this didn't strike me as right as well. So so it's not actually mercy in the sense of Gnade, but what mercy kind of conveys is that in that situation, Hegel does not think that what is happening is that we suspend the right in some way, or we give a little bit of a leeway. So although this thing belongs to someone else, we don't want to be too strict about it, and we give a little bit of leeway. That's not what's happening. And it's also not that we just suspend the right so that we forget about the fact that this object belonged to someone else, is owned by someone else, but rather we introduce a right that can trump the other right on its own terms. So that's how I understood it. And that's why I kept the mercy. But it would be very helpful if other people that know the English or American legalese better could help me out finding a better way of translating this. So I was unsure about this as well. And yeah, and in terms of where do we want to take this in the end? So the point where I'm at is that I think that we need an answer that at least includes 2 stages. So you were suggesting now, so there's a possibility of introducing more rights and thereby kind of fixing the problem. And the other option would be forget about rights. Now understand that if we bring everything into the form of subjective rights, we will not be able to constitute a normative order that is up to the task. And what I think is that we would need a response on both levels. So I agree with you that we ultimately have to supersede the form of subjective rights in order to answer or respond to that situation. What I'm struggling with is, also struggling with in more general terms in Hegel, is to understand what remains of abstract right once we are part of an ethical life. So in the progression of the book, you have the abstract right, which is approaching a certain realization of freedom, is doing that, but in insufficient and defective terms, and that brings us to morality, and then another transition is happening, and then we have ethical life, and abstract right and morality are supposed to be moments of that ethical life. I think I have an understanding how morality is a moment of ethical life, but what exactly does it mean that abstract right is a moment of ethical life? How is it refigured? How are rights now differently understood? How are they put into context by becoming a part of ethical life or by becoming instruments of an ethical life? So that's not totally clear to me, because Hegel doesn't really say much about this. I mean, this would require our kind of reformulation, what he's doing in describing civil society and what role Rechtspflege has there and so on. And in that regard, what I want to say is that what would need to be a part of this kind of recontextualization of abstract right would be to introduce rights against rights. So, and it would not be enough to just add other rights, because all individual rights are limiting each other, but it would have to be rights of a different sort. This Notrecht, this right of distress, is one instance that Hegel talks about. And I'm wondering whether this can be an inspiration for other ways, other forms of rights that retranslate the bigger concern of the whole in the form of subjective rights, that give them the place in the realm of abstract right. But this is, I appreciate this is, I acknowledge this is very abstract, and I'm not able to make this more concrete or to give you a concrete solution, or in that case.
Thank you. Jake McNulty, we didn't get you in this morning. Why don't you go next?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas. I found this really interesting. I wanted to ask, I mean, so I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea of Notrecht, and I think I'm with Bob Stern here that, when we confronted with cases where somebody, is in such dire straits that they would die unless infringements on other people's rights were made, well, my answer is, well, it's not that, we need to expand our conception of right, it's that we need to ditch the idea of right and focus on something else, like welfare. So with that in mind, I wanted to ask you a couple of things. One is that Notrecht is in the morality part, right? So there's a kind of, the way I always read that was that you're not going to get Notrecht out of abstract right alone. You have to go to morality where considerations of welfare come up. And then the second point has to do with what you were just talking about, which is the way that abstract right is reconfigured in civil society. The way I've read that typically is that abstract right in the first part of the book is sort of neo-Lockean. It's this harsh thing. Your need for something doesn't give you a right to it. It's really just about who got there first. Whereas in civil society, it's the good old European welfare state. There is something like a right to welfare, and that's why the corporations and the Polizei and everyone, get together and help you out when you're hard up. But with that in mind, I mean, so to put it a little more pointedly, isn't the place to look for an expanded conception of right in which welfare is taken into account civil society and not so much abstract right itself, exploding itself. It doesn't seem to explode itself because of Noterecht. Maybe it explodes itself because of revenge or something like that, but Noterecht is a morality thing.
Right, thanks. Yes, so I don't want to say that it explodes abstract right, and I should also maybe clarify, so I didn't want to give a good interpretation of the right of distress, so I didn't want to give an understanding of this particular institution, but I wanted to point to the fact that in this paragraph and in this kind of idea, Hegel confronts the two types of ownership that I have isolated in abstract right. So that's what's happening, what makes this passage interesting for me. So isolating these two types of ownership, we see here that the right to life has a certain different, that it opens up a right against subjective rights, and therefore points us beyond the constellation of abstract right. And interestingly, it is at first developed in the realm of abstract right. So we understand it in terms of ownership at first, but then only while developing the notion, understand that it's a different type of ownership. So it's present within the realm of abstract right, yet we see an internal division of abstract right coming to the fore here. So that's why I'm interested in the notion. You're certainly right that obviously it's part of the morality chapter, and considerations of welfare are already brought in there. And so that's the kind of framing that Hegel himself gives for it. I kind of abstract from that context in order to confront the two types of ownership I have isolated. And so I recognize that this is kind of abstracting from the text itself. Other than that, I see what you're saying, but I don't see why I couldn't do both, or why I shouldn't do both. So why I shouldn't recognize that that we need to turn to civil society or to welfare, to civil society as part of ethical life in order to deal with these problems more. And on the other hand, reflect about the way in which this is present as a tension within the realm of abstract right, and ask for modes and ways in which this can be reflected in certain specific types of rights that are part of abstract right. I don't think that those two ways of looking at the problem would exclude one another, or I would rather think they can help each other. One final remark. So what I find very interesting about the way in which the notion of life is made richer in the section on abstract right compared to the issue of welfare is the following. So if we introduce this notion that you just briefly brought up, the notion of need, and say, well, there's a different concern here, we need to look out for welfare and so on. Then we kind of introduce a new element of, so there's a way of doing that where we just introduce another value that needs to be factored in. Whereas in the section on abstract right, it becomes clear that we cannot disregard our bodies and our lives because they are the basis of the existence of freedom. As a free being, I live in my body. So that means the manifestation of my freedom, even the abstract freedom of abstract right, the actions of my will, is relying on my body and my life. And that's why we need to introduce it here. So it's internally connected to the notion of the free will. So that's what I find interesting or helpful there. But thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mark McCormick, you also didn't get a chance to raise your question last time. If you can keep it brief, that'd be great.
Sure. This problem between abstract rights and maybe this more concrete version of right in the ethical life. You're saying that Hegel doesn't say much about it, but I think he really does. But we've been overlooking it because we're focused in a one-sided way on this sort of slaughter bench version of history where they're always in conflict. The particular version of our interests, of our free will, can never be sublated in a harmonious way in a sort of universal state. So this is why he's against Kant's notion of, a League of Nations, because you can't have this sort of authority externalized. It has to be a part of the abstract right version of the connection to the state. So if you don't have both elements, you can't have anything beyond the League of Nations. And that's too particular. It has to become more universal to overcome that. So I'm wondering, you're saying he doesn't talk about this universalization of the particular will as a synthesis of a higher spirit with the state. But I think he does. Isn't that how the philosophy of right ends? That he ends with this sort of sublation of abstract right with ethical life. And that's why it's a moment of ethical life, right? Or they're both moments of this sort of higher universal state. And that most people don't believe this higher universal state or this blessed history is possible because they don't understand how science plays a role in making abstract right reason so that you can achieve a sort of flow state that is necessary to achieve that sort of overcoming of the slaughter bench by internalizing the negation rather than abstractly eliminating the negation. You can never eliminate the negation. It has to become a sublation. And the only way to do that is by adopting science in its true rational state or form in the abstract right so that it is reflected in the universal state as a rational state. Did you read anything about this as the connection of the two?
Yeah, thanks. So I think this is helpful because, I mean, I agree with you that Hegel says a lot about the difference of abstract right and ethical life and about the transition from one understanding, fundamental understanding of what right is to the other. And that the structure of ethical life is characterized by a more universal structure that you were pointing to. So all of this I would not deny, and Hegel says a lot about it. What Hegel does not really do is or I think at least it's unclear to me how exactly he does it, is in describing the structure of ethical life, revisit the notion of abstract right and tell us now how it functions and operates within ethical life. How we have to understand it and how it might have to be, our understanding might have to be modified if you understand abstract right as a substructure, as an instrument, as a medium of ethical life. That was the issue that I found missing or that I'm struggling with for articulating myself.
Thank you. We're just to try to get everybody in who hasn't said anything today. Let's go with Jonas Heller next.
Thanks, Thomas, for your talk. I have a specific question about the relation of freedom and body in terms of our own body. Yeah, I find it very convincingly that you say that the property right over our body is limited and our freedom is thus limited in some way since this very freedom depends upon our body. And so now I'm wondering how exactly this relation of dependence can be understood, this relation between our freedom and our body. And it seems to me that there are two options. One option is rather weak, and this would just mean that our body is kind of passive material basis. So it's just the other outside thing in some way what our freedom needs. And the other option, and this is strong, and I'm interested in if you see that option as well, is that our body is not only a passive part of our freedom, but in some way takes actively part in freedom. And this then would lead to another maybe formulation, not just the body of right, but a true right of the body. So do you see this other side as well in Hegel or beyond Hegel, that there is a that the body takes actively part in freedom? And what would this mean if so? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So I'm not sure whether I would articulate the stronger reading in the way you just did. I think that I would agree that the weak reading, as you pointed it out, that it's just the material basis, is too little. That's not enough to grasp the existential and essential function that it has. And I think that this nicely comes out in the way in which Hegel describes that the way others see our freedom, see us as free in our bodies, and recognize us as free in our bodies, even if we haven't appropriated them yet. And so this makes it more than just a material basis. It's the reality, it's the existence of my freedom. If freedom has to become Sein für andere, then it being embodied is not an inessential addition or just a material basis. It is something more. Now, the way you were describing the stronger version, it seemed to me that what you were describing was, in a certain sense, an Eigenrecht des Körpers, so a certain kind of right that the body has of its own against me or against myself, against the person or the rational will that lives in it. And I think there are aspects in which I can see this mode of talking as useful, but I'm afraid that there's a tendency then to separate myself from the body in a way that I don't want to. But I rather think that the kind of normative value that the body has is being articulated by me seizing my body, by me grasping it, by me articulating it. So it's precisely not a separate right that my body has vis-a-vis myself, but we have to think about it in a more integrated way. So that's why I'm hesitant about the way you were phrasing the stronger reading. But yeah, so maybe one way of articulating this as well is, so Hegel points out that in his articulation in the philosophy of right, that human beings can mutilate and kill themselves. And I bring this up in the beginning of my treatment, where it seems to be the case that what he's here saying is we can treat our bodies as a thing. Now, what I want to do, however, is I want to develop his notion in such a way that we can see our relation to our body is not a thing, not the relation to a thing in our life, but still keep his insight into the ability and also even the normal, I mean, I'm not sure whether we're entitled, but into the possibility of us mutilating ourselves or killing ourselves. We can't understand this as, if we kill ourselves, we can't understand this as getting rid of a thing that is inessential to us. It's a much deeper act. It's a much more problematic and troubling act, because we're not just doing that. I mean, getting rid of a thing wouldn't be a big issue. We are getting rid of ourselves by doing that. And that's something we can do. But so I think for me, the inseparability of the two is important, but not in order to diminish the normative value that the body has, but rather in order to underline it.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Thomas. Let's all give Thomas a hand. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I apologize that you can't see me anymore. I failed to switch on the light, and now it's been dark. It's gotten dark in Berlin. So I'm sorry. I will turn on the light now.
Yeah,
thanks so much
to everybody who spoke this morning and asked questions. I think we're going to stick to our time frame and come back at 1 o'clock. I know this cuts our break a little.